Tilder! Today we're going to be talking about narrative lens kits in 3 different price tiers if you're a beginning or intermediate filmmaker. A few things to note: I'm not going to consider photography in any of my choices. These lens selections are primarily for the micro four thirds sensors or the Super 35 sensors. I will mainly be referencing each focal length look in terms of its full frame equivalency. Upon making this video, this is not going to be the last one. There's actually going to be a follow-up video dedicated to vintage lenses because there's a lot to go over and I only skimmed the basics of it in this video. Tilder! Under $200. Panasonic 14-42 Mark II, because it's cheap, small, easy to learn narrative focal lengths, and can be useful in the future if you decide to use single-handed gimbals in your work. Option 2. Panasonic 25mm 1.7. It's fast, it's small, it's sharp, probably the best way to learn how to be a filmmaker when you are stuck to one single focal length, and it's also useful for gimbals in the future. Option 3. A vintage Vivitar 28mm or 35mm, or if you want to go with a zoom, Vivitar 28-90mm. With a passive speed booster and a regular adapter, these lenses can be used in the future if you decide to switch up to a Super 35 sensor or even a full frame sensor. Don't let these lenses fool you. Even though they're old, they have decent optical quality. Around $500. Option 1. Get a Viltrox active adapter with a booster or not. Pair it up with a Sigma 17-50mm. It's a great one-solution lens for wide to portrait lengths. However, it has a short focus throw, but you can definitely train yourself to get better with it. If you know you're going to eventually be getting a Sigma 18-35, then you might want to start piecing this kit together slowly and get the lens first before you get the adapters. Option 2. Vintage Contax Zeiss lenses, specifically the 28mm 2.8 and the 50mm 1.7. If you want to go with a zoom only, then get the 28-85mm lens. Get the legendary Zeiss look for a fraction of the price. Will work if you move up to a Super 35 or a full frame camera. Under $2,000. Option 1. Viltrox plus Sigma 18-35 and the Canon 50mm 1.8. This is the low light budget special. Takes care of everything you will ever need on a film set. Option 2. Viltrox plus Sigma 18-35 with your choice of 50-100 or the 50-150. This is the budget full focal length special. Literally everything you will ever need in terms of focal length for a film. Option 3. If you want to go the vintage route, there's actually quite a few different lens companies that you can buy from. Specifically, I would say either the Contax Zeiss, Canon FD, Olympus OM, Takumar Pentax, Asahi Pentax, Leica. As long as you pair it with the right speed booster, you will be fine. Get the focal lengths of 28mm, 50mm, 85mm, and if you really want to, either a 105 or a 135mm. These lenses will be great on either micro four thirds, Super 35, or even full frame cameras. I didn't choose any zoom lenses, but if you really want to, you can definitely add it to the kit. If I knew everything I know now, what would I do if I started over? I take my GH5 and get a generic booster, followed by a non-booster adapter, and I would get a 28mm prime as well as a 50mm prime. I would either choose the Vivitar brand or the Image Premium Contax Zeiss brand. That's probably what I would have started with and probably stayed for a while, until I eventually got the Sigma 18-35 for convenience. Done! Roll that intro! What's up everybody? You're watching Too Long Didn't Read Filmmaker, where the answers comes first, the reasons come last, but we are constantly and always still learning. So today we are going to finish off the series of lens videos for beginning and intermediate filmmakers, and this week we're specifically dealing with budgets and what lenses I would suggest depending on your budget tiers. Now, as we get into this, I need you to understand one thing. Don't think of this video as like, oh, $1,000 means I'm gonna get the best quality possible and I'm going to have a really amazing looking movie. No, you can actually have the same impact at the lowest lens tier, and it's gonna give you the same feel as the highest lens tier. I know that doesn't make sense right now to some people, but please understand. Lens is just a very small equation to the whole story. You need to think about, what lighting are you going to use? What characters do you have? What story do you have? How are you going to direct them? What are they wearing? How are they moving? How's the camera moving? And the list goes on and on. Sound design. Sound design is a huge one. And the way you edit it. All of those equations match into a movie. The lens is just a small portion, so please do not think that buying $15,000 worth of lenses is going to make you a better filmmaker than the filmmaker that bought $200 worth of lenses. The $200 person, if he knows how to direct a film and do everything that I just talked about and give an overall look, he's going to come out on top, or she's going to come out on top, versus the person that spent the most money. Now, before we actually get into the lens choices, again, you need to listen to a couple more things that I need to talk about, because I'm going to be throwing a lot of lenses at you, a lot of numbers, there's some conversions involved, and if you don't have an understanding of where I'm coming from in terms of my choices, then this video is going to get very, very confusing. So please listen to this next segment before we actually get to my lens suggestions. Number one, I am only going to be talking about narrative filmmaking in terms of these lenses. I am not considering photography at all. The reason I'm not going to get into photography is because every photographer has a completely different preference in terms of how they want to use the lenses, and I just don't want to get into that territory at all. So every lens I'm talking about is specifically for narrative filmmaking and to a certain degree, documentary filmmaking as well. Number two, most of you that have followed me already know that I shoot on a Panasonic GH5, and before that I shot on a Panasonic GH4. Now, this video is going to be more geared towards the Micro Four Thirds system, also the APS-C Super 35 system. To a certain degree, some of the lens choices I make are full frame lenses, so that could be transferred over to full frame. But if we get into more full frame lenses and options, we're going to be jumping into a completely different price tier. So if you want me to kind of tackle the full frame idea, just let me know in the comments and I can make another video based on full frame only. But for now, just realize I'm only going to be gearing this towards Micro Four Thirds sensors and Super 35 sensors. Number three, because all my suggestions are going to jump between different sensor sizes from Micro Four Thirds all the way to full frame, you need to understand how to convert them to one single standard. And that single standard happens to be the full frame equivalent. Now, the reason that we're going to go towards the full frame equivalent is because that seems to be the industry standard that most people understand what you're talking about. They understand what it means when you're talking about a 24mm look versus an 85mm look. They don't generally realize what it means when you say, well, I want a 12mm look and let's get a 25mm look in there. They're like, those all sound very, very wide, like I don't get it. So you need to understand that we're going to be talking about full frame equivalent here. And to do it is actually quite simple. There's just a very easy conversion. If we're talking about Micro Four Thirds lenses, you simply take those focal lengths and just multiply it by 2, and that gets you to the 35mm full frame equivalent. If we're talking about crop sensor lenses, take that focal length, multiply by 1.5, and that gets you to the full frame equivalent. If we are talking about using a focal reducer on either a full frame or a crop censored lens, so basically what you do is you take your focal length from that lens, either full frame or crop sensor, then you multiply it by the focal reducer's multiplier, which is usually 0.71, and then you take that number and you multiply it by whatever system you're using. So if you're using a Super 35 sensor, then you multiply it by 1.5. If you're using a Micro Four Thirds sensor, then you just multiply it by 2. Please understand, if you are using a Super 35 crop censored camera, you can't take a crop censored lens, slap a focal reducer on it, and use it on that same camera. The image circle is going to get way too small on your sensor and you're going to get heavy vignetting. This is something that a lot of people don't generally understand. And same thing goes for Micro Four Thirds lenses. Some people have asked, hey, can I take a Micro Four Thirds lens and put a focal reducer on it and therefore make it even faster? No, you can't, because that Micro Four Thirds image circle was made for that sensor. If you make it even smaller than the sensor, you're going to get vignetting and it serves you no purpose. So please realize that these equations just kind of give you a general idea. A lot of people will probably argue that no, that's not technically correct, that's flawed, that doesn't make any sense. I get it. On a technical level, it's a very, very, very general formula. However, it does get you close to what it is in terms of full frame equivalency. And honestly, if you use this equation and get to the image you need, who's going to be asking? And the last final thing that we need to think about before we start getting into the suggestions, depending on your budget, is you can kind of look at this as a lens buying roadmap, because let's be honest, not all of us have $1,500 to $2,000 to spend right away. So what you can do is, as we get through this video and you start looking at the lens choices I'm telling you about, followed by what they look like and what they can do for you, you can kind of look at the highest tier and say, well, I definitely want that lens eventually, and I want this lens eventually. You can start from the very lowest tier, get something that you can work with, practice on it, learn your craft, and then as you start making money, you can then upgrade to the next lens that's going to be part of your ultimate kit. And then same thing, from there you're using all these lenses, maybe you sell one off because you don't need the other one anymore, and then you ultimately get to the last place. And by then, when you get to that higher tier of lenses, you already know exactly what you need to do to get every look that you want, how you craft your movies, and therefore it's kind of earned, and you have a much better understanding of why you needed it, instead of me telling it to you, but you're still a beginning filmmaker and you don't realize why your movie still doesn't look good. And that just goes right back to the first point. Please do not think that spending more money on lenses is gonna make your movie good. It's not. The more creative person at the $200 lowest tier level of lenses has the exact same opportunity to make a very impactful movie versus someone who spent hundreds and thousands of dollars on equipment. In the end, it comes down to what's in here, your creativity, and your storytelling abilities. Whew, okay, let's get to the suggestions. All right, starting off at the lowest tier, under $200, and this is going to be going towards the Micro Four Thirds system, and that is none other than the kit lens 14mm to 42mm. Now, if you do the equation, that's going to give you a full frame equivalent of a 28mm all the way to an 84mm. Now, this kit lens is awesome because it does handle everything from your wide angle 28mm all the way to your portrait 84mm and everything in between. So this lens is very nice and small, and basically it's going to give you a nice, awesome focal range so that you start to play around with your understanding of what focal lengths you need for what specific shots. And we've kind of already talked about that before. Now, the only con about this lens is that the manual focus ring is not very smooth. It's a little bit grippy, so if you're going to do a lot of rack focuses, it's probably not the best option. However, when you're just starting out, you might not really need to use that feature, or you can just use the predetermined focus feature on the GH5 to kind of do a little bit of pull focus. Now, the reason that I would even suggest this lens is because when you eventually get to the upper tier and you start using a 3-axis gimbal, I talked about this last week, zoom lenses on the heavier side are going to have a really hard time balancing, whereas a Micro Four Thirds lens, especially of this size, will have no problem balancing. It's also going to be able to communicate with the IBIS that's inside, and you have multiple focal lengths that you can deploy on a single-handed gimbal instead of having to switch it out with other prime lenses. And that's why my very first suggestion for the $200 and under is the Panasonic 14 to 42mm Mark II. My second suggestion is another Micro Four Thirds lens, and that is none other than the Panasonic 25mm 1.7. Now, this is a prime lens, so you can't move in and out and get closer to your subject from a distance. Now, the reason I'm adding this into the mix is, yes, it does fall under the under 200 category. I would only buy it when it's on sale at $150, or you can get it used as low as $80 depending on the person. So it's definitely a very awesome budget setup. It's great for low light shoots because it's got a nice wide open aperture for the GH5. And honestly, if you get really crafty, I actually think that this lens is going to make you a better filmmaker because you are forced into using one singular focal length. And it just so happens that this focal length is pretty versatile. You can do wide angle shots, you can do close-ups, you can do medium close-ups. It's all going to look really good. Also, for the future, if you decide to use a gimbal, a 25mm, which is a 50mm look, if you do the equation of multiplying by a 2, That 50mm on a gimbal in a moving shot is beautiful. I don't really like to use a wide angle 24mm equivalent to get a gimbal shot because it makes things look way too far away and it doesn't give a nice, good look in my opinion. So if and when you decide to go with a single-handed gimbal, using this little prime lens is going to balance super easy, and you're going to have access to your ability to change focus with the GH5's internal follow focus transition feature. And pretty much, I know I said I wasn't going to talk about photography, but if you're going to use photography, this lens is going to work well for you too. And that's why my second choice for you is going with just the Panasonic 25mm 1.7. And the last setup for the under 200 category, we are going to jump into full frame lenses, but specifically vintage full frame lenses. Now, when I say vintage, I basically mean any lenses made from the 70s, 80s. Pretty much all these lenses do exist out in the market on eBay, and they are a steal for the optical quality you can get. So you actually have two different choices, or if you actually can find them at the right price, you can get all three for under $200. And the selections are none other than the Vivitar 28mm f2.5 or the Vivitar 35mm 2.8. Now this is the prime route. If you want to go with the zoom route, then I would suggest none other than the Vivitar Series 1 28mm to 90mm f2.8-3.5. Now to go along with those vintage lenses, you need a couple more things to add to the kit. You need a general focus reducer, just a generic one. You don't need to go too crazy with it. I have this one that I've used for a very long time. It cost me $90 off of eBay and it has worked very well. You also need a non-optical adapter because this is going to allow you to get an extra range out of your vintage lenses. And then the last thing you need to buy is a little adapter that turns these vintage lenses into an EF mount. Now, one thing you need to understand about these vintage lenses is that these are full frame lenses. So if you do upgrade your camera body in the future from micro four thirds to super 35 to full frame, you're good to go. However, there's something that I really want you to kind of think about and understand. The reason that vintage lenses work on all these mirrorless cameras is because back in the day, there needs to be more distance from the lens to the body's sensor. And today, because everything's mirrorless, everything is super, super close. That's why when you buy a little adapter, it extends the lens further away to what it used to be on the native body of the cameras back in the day. Now, contrary to popular belief, everyone says just get a bunch of Nikon mount lenses because that had the furthest flange distance and therefore you have the best compatibility for the future. That is true. However, Nikon lenses focus in a different direction compared to what every other camera manufacturer does. So some people get a little irky about that, some people not so much. For me, I don't care. But in general, there's a lot of things that are made for EF mounts more so than Nikon mounts. So you need to look for either M42 screw mount, Pentax PK mount, Contax Yashica mount, or the Olympus OM mount. These mounts are going to be able to adapt to an EF mount very easily. Now, there are plenty of other vintage mounts out there. Please listen to this very carefully. I usually want you to be able to convert your old vintage lenses to the EF mount system. Because if you look at like the Eva 1 or the Ursa Mini, those use EF mounts. You have a ability to use that. So I want you to be able to jump to that system, no problem. When you get to the FDs and the Minolta MDs, those flange distances are actually a lot shorter than the EF mount, and you would need a really weird adapter that has an optics inside that kind of works as a teleconverter. And by all reviews, everyone says it completely destroys your image. Everything gets super, super soft, and there's just no way to get a sharp image out of it. So therefore, there's really no reason for you to go with this route. However, Minolta MDs and Canon FDs are amazing, amazing lenses. So if you suddenly decide, you know what, I kind of want to just go with Canon FDs because all the reviews I'm looking at have a really great image, go for it. So all you have to do is just get the correct speed booster and passive adapter for the Micro Four Thirds system, or the right adapter for a full frame system. All right, and now we're gonna get into the middle tier, which is approximately $500. Now, once you get into this tier is when we take away the Micro Four Thirds lenses completely and we start getting into the crop censored APS-C lenses. When we get into these lenses, we have two options. We can either use a adapter that has no speed booster optic, or we can use one that does have a speed booster optic. So that being said, you have a choice of either the Viltrox EFM1, which has no speed booster, or the speed boosted version, the Viltrox EFM2. The lens choice is the Sigma 17-50 2.8. Now, this is really awesome on the used market because you can get them for about $200, and then when you add it to the adapter, that gets you close to $500. So this lens is very nice because it gives you a very, very nice focal range. When we're talking about its Super 35 equivalent, it's basically kind of like a 28 millimeter, 27 millimeter, and it gets you close to 75 millimeters. That's if you use the speed booster on it on your GH5. If you're using it on a crop sensor camera already, no worries. That's basically what it kind of is, 28 to 75. Now, I know this is not gonna make any sense, so please just understand that this is just an approximation. Don't slam me on this, but if you're gonna use this with a non-speed boosted adapter, treat this like a 2x multiplier, and it's gonna give you something like a 34 millimeter all the way to a 100 millimeter. It's actually gonna be slightly wider, but just use that as a general approximation because we don't know how that image circle is moving as you zoom in and out of the range. Now, this is where we're gonna kind of get into that lens buying roadmap here, because I used to own the Sigma 17-50 and it had about a 30-degree focus throw, which is very, very short. However, you can extend it by getting some lens gears that extend away from the lens body, and that gives you a little bit more finite focus. It doesn't help a lot, and actually a lot of people have just gotten used to pulling focus very, very slowly. But if that's something you foresee yourself feeling like it's a pain, there's a couple things you can do. You can either buy the speed boosted adapter first, or you can buy the lens first. I would actually say buy the Sigma 18-35 first, and then slowly make your way and buy that electronic adapter. I know this is gonna throw you further from the budget, but again, if you already knew you were gonna work your way up to that lens once you get good enough with your gear, then if you're already making your way to the second tier, you might just need to kind of inch your way slowly towards that last tier. Now, the second option for the $500 tier is we're going back to the vintage full frame manual lenses again, except this time we're getting Zeiss lenses. If you have been doing your lens research or anything like that, you've probably heard of that name before, and yes, it's quite a prestigious name, and these lenses carry a very awesome image along with it. So what you're looking for is to get yourself a generic speed booster, a speed boosted adapter, and of course the adapter to turn these vintage lenses into an EF mount. And the two lenses that you will need if you're going the prime route is the Contax Zeiss 28mm f2.8 and the Contax Zeiss 50mm 1.7. Now, again, these are full frame cameras, but when you put it with the speed boosted adapter, you're getting effectively a 40mm look followed by a 75mm look, which basically covers pretty much your wide, your medium, and close-ups on this end with a 28mm, and then if you're using the 50mm, you're really getting a nice portrait look. Now, if you take off the speed boosted adapter and just use the regular passive adapter, you're going to get a 56mm look followed by a 100mm look. So now you're getting into the telephoto ranges, and you're also getting into just a little bit closer in terms of the normal focal range. Now, these vintage lenses are very nice, they're very sharp, and you can only find them on a used market, and you definitely want to hunt for a while because you don't want to just buy the first one you see, because these prices go up and down with the seasons. Once you find the right deal, go ahead and jump on it, and that's gonna keep you at a much better advantage in terms of saving money. Now, even if you do just buy what people are selling it for, you're still gonna get under that $500. But generally speaking, take your time, wait for the right deal, save your money, and it will all be worth it. Now, if you don't want to go the prime route, then I would suggest the Contax Zeiss 28mm to 85mm f3.3-4. Now, this is a very interesting zoom lens, and if you aren't familiar with vintage zoom lenses, some vintage zoom lenses, you actually have to pull and push the barrel to zoom in and zoom out. Now, if you're not familiar with how vintage zooms work, some vintage zooms do work the way it does now, where you can have a different focus ring to operate the zoom. But generally saying, back in the day, you actually had to push and pull the barrel to zoom in and out. And that same mechanism also allows you to focus. It might take some getting used to, but again, you're getting a very awesome focal range because at that 28mm, specifically with that speed booster, you're getting to that 40mm look, which is awesome for pretty much everything you're gonna shoot. And then when you get to 85, you're getting, I think, into 110 or 115 millimeters. So you're getting into that telephoto territory. And of course, if you take off that speed booster and use a regular passive adapter, your reach is just gonna go even further. So that is your second option in terms of using vintage prime lenses at a very nice price point. All right, and now we're getting into the final tier, which is anything above $500 all the way to $1,500. Now, again, we're gonna start off with some electronic lenses, and the first batch is going to be the Sigma 18-35, followed by the Canon 50mm 1.8 Mark II. Now, the reason I'm saying to go with these two lenses is because we already know about the Sigma 18-35. It gives you that nice wide angle all the way to 50mm look when it's on a speed booster. But sometimes you need to get into that portrait territory, and that's where this 50mm comes in, because when it's on a speed booster, this 50mm is indeed a full frame lens, so it's gonna get you up to a 75mm f1.2 or f1.3. So you're gonna get that nice creamy out of focus bokeh. Now, this lens pairing is great because it's a very minimal setup, all things considered. You basically just have a nice zoom lens that takes care of everything you need. And then when you need that nice close-up out of focus shots, then you just pop on that 50mm and you can go right away. So this is definitely one of the setups that I actually went with for a very long time before I went to setup number 2. Setup number 2 is none other than the Viltrox Speed Booster, followed by the Sigma 18-35, and then the Sigma 50-150. Now, you don't have to go with the 50-150 if you don't want to. You can definitely go the 50-100 route and complete the entire set. Now, again, I would highly suggest to buy it used. There's really no reason for you to have to buy it new unless you really want to. But when you buy it used, you can definitely save yourself almost up to $400 some. But again, I understand certain things I want to buy new, I won't buy used, but for lenses, I always like to hunt for a good deal. So that being said, that would definitely be your cream of the crop setup with a speed booster. And the final selection for the electronic lenses is a full frame zoom lens actually, and that is going to be paired up with the Viltrox Speed Booster. And you can either get the Sigma version or the Canon version, but basically you want the 24mm to 105 f4. Now, paired up to that speed booster, it's going to turn it into more or less a 35mm all the way to a 140, I think, and that's going to go down to an f2.8. Again, this one lens pretty much rules every focal length that you could possibly want in terms of a narrative film. So basically, one lens to rule them all. All right, and the final solution on this highest tier, if you're gonna go the vintage lens route, is pretty much anything and everything that you want. Now, when you get to this vintage route, you can either, again, go with Vivitar lenses, you can go with Canon FD lenses, you can definitely go with Contax Zeiss lenses, or you can go even with Leica lenses. And pretty much what you're looking for is you're looking for either a 28mm, a 50mm, and then an 85mm. These three primes pretty much handle everything you would want in terms of what you're looking for on a narrative film set. Now you'll notice that I basically only gave you primes because zoom lenses back then rarely had constant apertures, even though one of the selections that I gave you didn't have a constant aperture. But honestly, just put it at f4 and that speed booster puts it down to f2.8 and you should be good. But that being said, if you're coming up at this part and you really want something unique, these vintage lenses are awesome. Now I know I haven't really talked about vintage lenses yet, and I probably should in another video, so you heard it here. I'm actually going to extend this lens thing to talk about vintage lenses. But you need to understand that these vintage lenses are not gonna be your idea of super crisp and sharp. Even though they are, it's very different the way the coatings worked back then. Some people say, no, I need a very, very sharp lens. Kind of. The reason that I like vintage lenses is because it does give that nice softness to it, and everyone's always searching for that nostalgic filmic look. And basically these vintage lenses will get you pretty close because back then film wasn't razor sharp. The movies we watched aren't razor sharp. In fact, all the movies that I'm watching now in theaters, even those aren't razor sharp. And that has a whole lot to do with either the projector it's being projected on or even the lenses that they are using. So that being said, if you decide to go with these vintage lenses, just remember that they are going to give you a completely different look compared to modern lenses that are almost clinically sharp. All right, guys, I know that was a whole lot of information with lenses, numbers, prices. What is the bottom line here of this entire video? The bottom line is, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you want to stay at $200 or under, or you want to aspire up to $1,500, or maybe you just want to kind of slowly work your way to $500 some worth of lenses. Any of these tiers are going to allow you to start filming and get some good looking images right away. Now, I think a good question to ask is, if I knew everything I knew now and just flipped time and start over, what would I have actually done? What I would have actually done is started off and possibly stayed in the vintage route. I love my Vivitar 28mm 2.5. When you put it onto a booster and you put it onto the GH5, it gives you that very awesome, versatile 40mm look in terms of full frame equivalent. I actually purposely used this kind of focal length, even though I didn't use this lens on Maximilian. When I'm using my Sigma 18-35 and ran around doing a bunch of different shots, even in the fighting scenes, I actually would rotate it to the 28mm mark, which gives me that 40mm field of view. And I actually use that quite a lot. Now, if the fight got crazy and I actually had to move from point A to point B on foot and handheld very quickly, then yes, I would go a little bit wider so I didn't lose any chance of getting the shot. However, shots that I knew that I didn't have to move too much, I actually tried to stay in that 40mm equivalent, and most of the film was pretty much shot at that focal length. Now, does that mean I would have never ever wanted to go that Viltrox and Sigma 18-35 route? No, I still would have wanted to go that route because you just heard me say, sometimes I needed to go wider than 40mm, and definitely when I'm doing some certain close-ups, I would actually go all the way to the 50mm equivalent on that lens. So I probably would have still worked my way up to the zoom lenses for sure, but generally speaking, if I was a complete novice, a complete beginner, that 28mm f2.5 is going to get you a good amount of what you need, especially when you pair that up with a vintage 50mm, whether it's a Contax Zeiss or a Vivitar 1.7, that's going to also give you a very nice portrait length. Now, I only own Vivitar vintage lenses because they're the easier one to come by, and depending on which company or which serial number you buy it from, it actually comes from very, very reputable lens company. Tokina is actually in that bunch. Now, I don't actually own the Contax Zeiss lenses. However, a really good DP friend of mine does own an entire set of Contax Zeiss lenses. And one day he invited me over and I got to play around with them and take a look at what they looked like through my camera. Holy cow, they handle very well and the image is just gorgeous. Now, that being said, now that I'm thinking about it and as I'm spewing out all this information on vintage lenses, I guess this lens series is not over yet because we've talked a lot about modern lenses. However, I think we need to dive a little bit more into vintage lenses, especially if you guys haven't really thought about it yet. And hey, that's it for this week, everybody. It looks like we're gonna be extending this lens series just by one more video specifically on vintage lenses, because now that I'm thinking about it, there's definitely a whole lot of things I could not really talk about in terms of this video, and I want to make sure you guys are really informed. So if there's any major questions you have about vintage lenses in general or something very specific, go ahead and leave it down in the comments below. I will either answer them in the comment section or I will reply to you and say, hey, I want to add this question into the video because I think it's important. So please stand by for that. And as always, if anything what I've said today has already influenced you in terms of what lenses you want to go with, I would really appreciate it if you check out my Amazon or eBay affiliate links down below. Again, this costs nothing extra to you. It just gives me a little compensation so I can continue making videos like this for you. And as always, if you have any other questions, just comment below. I will get to them as fast as I can. And like and subscribe, and I'll see you next week.